GIS Day LinkedIn Live presentation. My name is Matt Wood. I'm the sales director for Cyient for our Geospatial group within Europe. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever it is, whatever it is where you are. I'd like to also thank our speakers for joining me today at relatively short notice. What we'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about something that's a little bit outside the norm for Cyient. In terms of, we're going to talk about how GIS is empowering a sustainable tomorrow, as implied in the title. And to do this, what we've done is we've invited some speakers from a range of different industries, for want of a better word, from the nonprofit sector, from startups, from venture capitalism, and from government organizations, all of whom are working to help us use GIS to power a more sustainable tomorrow. So we have with us today, I'm going to let them all introduce themselves, but I'll just mention who we have. We have Claudia Mendzil, who's the program director for the Seraphim SpaceCamp. We have Teri Freemantle, who is a senior Earth observation specialist from the satellite applications Catapult. We have Steve Penson, who is a data scientist from ACAPs. And we have Josh Gilbert, who is the CEO and co-founder of Sust Global. So what we're going to do is have everyone speak to us for a few minutes and talk about what they do and how that fosters the vital role that GIS can play within humanitarian and sustainability factors within our modern world. So Claudia, I think we're going to kick it off with you. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. So hello to everybody, I'm Claudia Mendzil. I'm the Program Director of Seraphim SpaceCamp. Seraphim SpaceCamp is an accelerator program focused on supporting space tech startups in their journey to become investment ready and to build relationships with leading corporates, such as Cyient, for example, who are one of our corporate partners. We were launched back in 2018 by Seraphim Capital, who is one of the world's leading space tech investment companies, and our kind of thesis around startups and space technology is really backing the companies that are utilizing space technologies or geospatial imagery to solve on-Earth challenges. So a lot of the work that we're doing around kind of GSI for good is we're backing and supporting companies that are dealing with issues on Earth, usually around what we're seeing a big focus around now is climate change. So we've got Sust Global here, who are part of our Mission 6 program, who are providing real insights into kind of how the climate is impacting like assets, and in the future how it could potentially impact different assets. We've had companies that we've invested into who are using infrared imagery to be able to tell where there could potentially be people burning oil when they shouldn't be, where there could be potential wildfires in the future and predicting those, and also companies that are using that for sustainability of food and being able to ensure that we make the most out of crop management. So again, all kind of moving towards that sustainable future. And for us, it's also not just about the kind of geospatial analytics themselves. We're looking at companies that are having an impact across the whole of the data life cycle. So for example, we've been looking at companies that are able to provide data servers for some of these big geospatial constellations, but using less energy. So again, that kind of impact later down the line of using up less energy, moving towards a more sustainable future. I think it's not just us who are looking at these kind of space technologies, geospatial technologies. There are more and more VC funds around the world who are looking at these technologies, and in particular, a lot more kind of focused VC funds. We've seen the likes of Unilever are now concentrating on climate investments, allocating a really big budget to climate investments over the next few years. And we've seen, for example, Chris Sucker, who's one of the investors on Shark Tank, he's recently launched the Lower Carbon Fund. So we are seeing more investors looking at these companies who are not only looking at kind of working for good, but also are looking at companies that are also solving these really big customer challenges. And it's quite an interesting trend to see how customer challenges are linked to these kind of sustainable climate change practices in the future, and how that's happening more and more. So I think that's it for me from a kind of summary point of view as to what we're working on and what the trends we're seeing across VC and startups in this area.
Great. Thank you, Claudia. That was really nice. And I'm going to bring you back into the discussion later on. I forgot to mention before I introduce the next speaker that if you do have any questions in the audience, you can post them in the chat window, and then we'll take those up towards the end of the session. So I'd like to move over to Teri Freemantle now from the Satellite Applications Catapult. Teri, over to you.
Great, thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the introduction. So I'm a senior Earth observation specialist, and I work at the Satellite Applications Catapult. We are a not-for-profit, partially government-backed organisation with the primary remit to increase the use of satellite technologies, and with the goal to increase revenue for UK business. However, my primary focus with my team is working on humanitarian and international development projects, and I'm specifically going to talk to you now about some of the work we've been doing with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office working in Yemen. So, as you may be aware, Yemen is currently suffering from the world's worst humanitarian crisis as a result of years of protracted conflict. In addition to the security situation, there are limited humanitarian staff in country. Furthermore, data availability for Yemen is very poor and access is very restricted. And to support this, we provide geospatial support to the humanitarian network in Yemen, as well as the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. We work with a variety of partners, including ACAPs and REACH, as well as Transtech, as well as a wide variety of NGOs. The ultimate aim is to provide neutral expertise to identify use cases that could be met with geospatial technology and ultimately positively impact aid programs on the ground. Once a user need has been identified, we engage with the wider UK geospatial community to deliver the work. We want to make it easier and more transparent for FCDO and others to work with the geospatial industry and enable geospatial delivery solutions and data to support the humanitarian response. Now, a couple examples of some of the work we've been doing include a recent collaboration with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. This work was to estimate crisis attributable mortality in Yemen. That's the number of excess deaths above the baseline during the COVID-19 pandemic. We use high-resolution data to calculate the number of burials taking place in Aden Governor in Yemen, which was a COVID hotspot in the pandemic, and we estimated these for a baseline period as well as between January and September 2020. These data were used by LSHTM to fit alternative statistical models to estimate the new graves across cemeteries over this period. It's then possible to subtract the actual burials from the counterfactual, which is defined as the pre-pandemic baseline. This has proved to be really successful because there's been very limited data in country into the true scale of the death rate as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and has finally provided some more quantitative insight into how severe the situation is on the ground. We're now expanding this work into Somalia, and we've also been working with hope to work with the WHO and UN OPCHA to expand this further. Another example, which we did alongside the ACAPs team, was looking at the risk of a catastrophic oil leak from a floating storage vessel called the FCO Safa, which is based off the coast of Yemen. It's been in a state of disrepair for the last 5 years because of the war, and as such, it's at high risk of having a huge leak from the sort of figures about million barrels of crude oil that are currently stored on board. We worked with RiskAware, and they did some modelling, and then those outputs were provided back to the FCDO and policymakers at the UN level. So that's just a couple of examples of what we're doing, and we really want to continue to work with the geospatial industry to understand how we can facilitate these relationships going forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Teri. That was really interesting. And it's a matter that's close to my heart. I spent some time early on in my career working in the NGO world, and I've been fairly passionate about how we can use technology to improve the situation for those less fortunate than ourselves. You also provided a nice little link there to ACAPs. So with that, I'd like to introduce Steve Penson, who's a data scientist from ACAPs. Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Matt. Hi, everybody. My name's Steve Penson, and as said, I'm a data scientist at ACAPs. We are a independent non-profit NGO based out of Geneva with global hubs based in Yemen, Bangladesh, and also parts of South America as well. We aim to provide independent analysis of different crises in the world, and we have a team based out in Geneva as well, which collects information on global crises and monitors that on a monthly basis, as well as our different hubs out in different countries as well, where we collect information and we work with organizations such as Catapult to be able to do more in-depth analysis. Everything we do is fundamentally geographically focused. More recently, we've been having a shift towards the more data science point of view. Traditionally, we've been a very traditional analysis setup where we collect a lot of reports and then we use that to be able to influence policy decisions. But in more recent years, and in the last 6 months since the establishment of the data science team, we've been basically centralizing that information, making it more quantitative and adding a geospatial element to that information as well. As I said, we work closely with such as the Catapult teams, but also we work with UN OCHA, and recently we teamed up with Map Action and Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team to support the response to the Beirut explosion, whereby we were starting to do a secondary data review combined with geographical information of the explosion to support the search and rescue efforts in the 48 to 1 week after the explosion. So that's an example of where we focus as well. From a Yemen perspective as well, we have a full-based team out there, and we regularly do projects being able to monitor both economic tracking as well as the more geographical individual events such as the oil spill that was explained as well. So that's me. Hopefully that's a good explanation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Much appreciated. So we're going to switch gears now and talk to a very interesting startup who is looking at this problem from a slightly different angle. So I'd like to hand it over to Josh Gilbert, who's the CEO and co-founder of Sust Global. Josh, over to you. Sorry.
Thanks, Matt. And hi, everybody in the chat. Happy GIS Day. It's awesome to see so many of the comments on the side. I didn't know there was a GIS Day, so happy birthday to us, I guess. But yeah, so as Matt said, I'm Josh Gilbert. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Sust Global, where we, our mission is to quantify the accelerating climate impacts facing some of the world's biggest asset owners and investors. And we do this via our Geospatial climate intelligence platform, which basically fuses satellite-derived imagery, frontier climate models, geospatial data, and machine learning algorithms to transform all of this data into something usable for the end customers, which tend to be financial services providers and global enterprises. So, as an example, if an asset owner has, a mortgage portfolio across the globe, say there are some assets in India, there are some assets in the UK and some in North America. Today, it's really difficult to get granular risk data on some of these risks, and then also to be able to look at the different scenarios in the future. For example, risk of flooding, risk of wildfire, risk of cyclones, and the damages that these can cause to the assets. So, really, it's a way of packaging up all of the different data sources that are available today. Like I said, whether that's satellites, other types of ground sensor data, and fusing them into something that's scalable across the world. So really, there's an easy way of understanding exactly the risks facing these companies. So, in terms of empowering a sustainable future, I think that we're really interested in kind of utilizing some of the cutting edge technologies. We're working with the Seraphim team, who have been great, as well as we're actually been working with the satellite Catapult as well. So shout out to Chris Hobbs and to Christian if they're on the call also. So that's kind of the top level with us. I think that really it's a way of going from we all know that climate change is happening, and we all know that there's technology available, but actually gathering all of the data sources and turning it into something that we can action. So kind of ensuring that we have this sustainable tomorrow, as the phrase is for this conference. That's kind of the asset level data where you can really drill down and understand, climate change isn't just a macro level thing that we hear about in the news. It's a real tangible thing that's causing real damage to our world and our assets that we manage. So yeah, that's it as an intro from me, Matt. Looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And I think, you've hit upon something that I think is going to be crucial here, which is how do we enable the large commercial organizations to understand that being more sustainable is actually a good thing for them economically. It's a sad fact that, although individually we may be altruistic when it comes to large organizations, large corporations, unless there's a financial benefit for them, it's very often difficult to persuade them to do anything. And I think what you're doing and what everyone else on the call is doing is going to help visualize and explain to these organizations what they can do and how it benefits them. And by benefiting them, it also benefits the rest of us as well. So Claudia, I'd like to come back to you to explore that a little bit more. You've introduced what the Seraphim SpaceCamp is, and I think it's a very valuable tool in helping startups come into being that will help us to make these changes. But it's also, you've got that delicate balance between the humanitarian and the commercial aspects. So in order to be humanitarian, commercial organizations still have to be viable financially. And I know from my time in various other organizations that that's often a very fine line to walk, because you have to, still make enough money to do what you need to do, but also finance your, ESG and CSR initiatives. So can you talk a little bit about how Seraphim approaches that when you're dealing with members of the SpaceCamp?
So ultimately, as we are a VC fund, we are looking to get almost a 10x return on any investments that we make into companies. And that is what the SpaceCamp program is about in terms of trying to get those companies to that point. But I think ultimately our ethos is backing these companies who are solving on-Earth challenges. We see the likes of, when we look at space and geospatial, we see people launching satellites, we see the SpaceXs, which is all incredibly exciting. But for us at the moment, we still are focusing on how can we improve what's happening on Earth. I think, as I mentioned before, we're seeing a lot more venture funds and maybe this isn't a good thing, the opportunity in these companies that are addressing climate displacement, climate challenges, sustainability. I think particularly because usually we're trying to invest into the next great technology challenges, but these technology challenges are being ever more linked to humanitarian and things for good, which I think is just a great example of how our communities are moving. More people are aware of around the world, and an ever more connected world on different crises happening around the world. We're more aware of climate change. We're more aware that we need to get prepared for this future and to ensure that things are sustainable. So I think there's a very close link that there are some great companies out there that are going to be really commercial, but are addressing these huge challenges. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think you can still be commercial and solve problems. One of the things that we want to really encourage, though, is at SpaceCamp, and one of the things that really helps these companies to grow is it's not just VC funding. It's all about bringing in non-for-profits and government agencies to also work with these companies, provide them with use cases, and also big corporates as well, getting their backing to validate technologies and to do pilots and POCs is incredibly helpful on that startup journey. And I think that would be interesting to kind of throw that back to you, Matt, is, how are you working in this area, particularly with the kind of GSI for good and also supporting startups? Yeah,
thank you, Claudia. So as you just mentioned, you bring in corporates as part of the SpaceCamp to work with these startups to help them shape their thinking and identify where their markets are and what their go-to-market strategies are. And Cyient has been a proud supporter of the Seraphim SpaceCamp since it started. And I think it is a challenge for corporations like Cyient. I'm acutely aware that we ultimately are a publicly traded company and we have to make money. But I think there is a growing awareness within corporations generally that they have to do more. And so, as I mentioned before, the challenge is to work out how we do that in such a way that allows us still to remain commercially viable, but also helps us to build commercial corporate social responsibility programs and ESG programs that support the startup ecosphere, the humanitarian actor ecosphere, and works in conjunction with organizations like Satellite Applications Catapult to make sure that we're doing this in the right way, and to make sure that we're doing it in a way that works for everybody. And it is a challenge. I've seen some organizations do it better than others. So from Science perspective, we support the SpaceCamp. We have a fairly significant corporate social responsibility program in India where we're based. Unfortunately, at the moment, it doesn't include any geospatial work, which I'm a little bit embarrassed about, and I didn't realize that until last week. So we're going to be starting to see if we can change that a little bit. But it is, as I say, it's a challenge. The trick is to find that balance. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is try and scroll through the comments here to find them. So I've got a question for you, Teri, from Eamon. How has the satellite applications Catapult used geographic modeling to model the spread of the COVID-19 virus this year? Is there any predictive modeling that you've been doing to do that, and where do you track it from? You're on mute, Teri. It's okay, it has to happen once every call.
Yeah, that was my turn. Thank you. So thanks for the question. And to clarify, we haven't been modeling the actual spread of the virus. We've been taking the estimations of new burials as a proxy indicator for mortality rates, and then have been modeling the impact of the scale of the mortality. And that's actually been undertaken by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. They're providing the epidemiological modeling on top of the geospatial data that we provided as an input to that model. Now, there is a non-peer review publication available online, which we could share with you afterwards, where the rest of the paper is going out for peer review. So that would be the best place to review all of the methods that are being applied.
Can also come in there
That's
as well,
cool.
if you'd like as well. So to help answer that question as well, so ACAPs have been working quite closely with the UN OCHA Centre for Humanitarian Data recently, as well as Map Action have been working with them as well. And what they've been doing is they've been creating models called OCHA Bucky, which was released about 2 weeks ago, which essentially is doing COVID modelling for around 24 different high priority humanitarian countries to be able to predict how different interventions of geographical location are starting to help spread the spread of COVID. For instance, if you look at lockdowns, you can use GIS to be able to predict what the influence on the roads closing will have on the impact of the spread of the virus. And that's how OCHA have been using different data sets. At ACAPs, we collect a data set called government measures, which starts to look into this. And then this all builds into a big model, which OCHA has helped develop and is now being used to be able to inform decision-making on the ground. So you can go to governments and say, if you reduce the amount of people that are being locked down, then you can predict the extent of the deaths that may happen because of that. We're also working closely with Imperial, London School of Economics, and WHO on these kind of things as well. So yeah, geographical context is very important in these kind of models as well.
Yep. One of my favorite phrases is that everything happens somewhere, so we need to make sure we're aware of it and using that to our advantage in all cases. So, Josh, I've got one for you that hasn't come from the audience, but it's come from me. So, we've talked a little bit about corporate social responsibility programs and environmental, social, and governance programs. What do you see as the path forwards here for those to create sustainable solutions with a geospatial aspect to them?
Yeah, I think that the evolution of the kind of CSR approach has been a really interesting one. If you look at maybe CSR 10 years ago, where it was in some ways, kind of a way of signaling that things were being done without necessarily explaining exactly how they were being done, at the corporate level. But we've seen a really interesting evolution, I think, towards ESG. Like they're all acronyms, right? They have to be buzzwords, but environmental social governance, right? And then even then it's kind of environmental issues, social issues and governance issues are kind of three completely different groupings, right? So there's still kind of issues with that. But I think, as we move towards an environment where, now shareholders are really engaged on these types of issues, and actually it's not just ticking a box and saying, hey, we're doing these things, as a stunt. It's actually really impacting the bottom line of businesses. So I think, that's a massive step forward for all of us. We're kind of holding people accountable across the globe for the things going on within business practices now, which is great. But also it creates an opportunity for technology, where the thing that Sust Global are doing is this asset level geospatial data, where you can actually, rather than have a top level view of a country or even an organization and say, hey, this is a score, we're going to give this company an 8 out of 10 for ESG. And you can say, well, is it 4 for E, 3 for S and none for G? Kind of quantifying that is really difficult. But I think with the technology that's becoming available now, we can really drill down and solve some of these real tangible outcomes, right? We can say at site X, within the supply chain, there is climate-related risks like this, and maybe even, there are governance-related issues in the boardroom, and then maybe social issues in terms of whether it's like a representative workforce, or many other issues in that area. So I think that like the granular data that we can deliver now, whether it's us or whether it's other companies, being able to have kind of process all of this big data, I think we're at a really, really amazing inflection point, both in terms of like doing good with our businesses, but also actually creating commercial opportunities. So I think it's a really exciting time where the kind of two macro trends are meeting in the middle.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think there are two interesting questions that I'd like to throw out to all of you. One is, from a big commercial perspective, you see things like the airlines offering you the opportunity to pay carbon credits when you buy your ticket, and various other initiatives like that, where companies are trying to pass the cost on to the consumers, if you like, so that everyone takes responsibility for it. What are your thoughts as a group on how successful those programs are, and are there better ways that we can do it by making it more visible to somebody what their impact is? So, for example, if I'm booking a flight, back in the days when we used to fly places, and I'm going to America for business meetings, and if KLM says to me, oh, would you like to buy X number of carbon credits? I might not do it. If they showed me, the map of my flight and said, this is the volume of carbon that you're consuming, that might have an impact on me. So who wants to go first in terms of their thoughts about how commercial organizations can get their customer base to buy into this idea of a more sustainable future? Don't all jump at once.
I'll take that. I'll take some thoughts on that if you like. So I think the importance of the informed consent at the consumer level was critical, and I believe that the communication of these benefits would actually, and the education of these benefits to those consumer communities would actually greatly impact the success of these programs, and ultimately incentivize the companies to continue to do it and actually invest in these approaches, because ultimately the long and the short of it is we're going to have to move towards a sustainable future, and it's becoming more and more known by the wider community that that's the case. So it's going to get to a point, in my opinion, where companies are going to have to adopt these policies, otherwise they're no longer going to be relevant and they're no longer going to be favored by their consumer base. So that's how I think that they should approach it.
Yeah. And Claudia, from an investment perspective, do you see in that market a move? I mean, I know there's been a move for a long time now to look for sustainable investment funds. Do you see a move in the investment community towards favoring organizations that have that sort of thing built into their DNA?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think generally with startups, there is an ethos of having a really good culture within the organization. The majority of startups that you see today are already building these kind of best practices around sustainability already into their mantra. Not just about kind of like sustainability in terms of climate change, but sustainability for their staff. There's lots of kind of cycle to work schemes that you see popping up on benefits. And the startups are kind of, I see, are trying, because they're smaller, because they're slightly more flexible from where they're more dynamic, they are able to incorporate these changes somewhat easier than some of these bigger corporates. So I think naturally just kind of like the general culture of a startup automatically incorporates this. And it's great to see that these companies that are starting out nowadays are just doing this almost as kind of fact. It's just what they do. And as they grow, they're going to keep those practices. But I think it's great to see that corporates, such as yourselves, are running these kind of sustainability programs and bringing them in too. I think it's just, we all know that things do need to become more sustainable in the future. All startups, corporates, government agencies, individual people. So I think we're just going to continue to see those trends as we move forward.
Okay, and a follow-up question has just come in from the audience here, and it's more about this year. So have you seen COVID-19 having an impact on VC investment in the sector, specifically where you are?
Oh, well, absolutely. I think when anything as big as this happens, it's going to impact investment. Interestingly, so when you go out to other VCs and you speak to them, the majority are keen to look at supporting the current portfolio, so ensuring that they continue through this crisis and managing that. And that's something that we've also done at Seraphim, both for the SpaceCamp companies and our portfolio companies. We, the guys over at the Seraphim Capital side, made it through the 2008 crash, and have been working on best practices with companies in those circumstances. So brought them forward to now preparing for a potential financial crisis because of COVID-19. So I think we've all been kind of preparing for that. I think people have been a little bit more reserved with their investments if they're looking to do new investments, but kind of concentrating on their portfolio. But at SpaceCamp itself, I'm seeing that kind of bucking the trend when it comes to these kind of geospatial spatial companies. I think it's one of the few sectors that hasn't been impacted by COVID-19. You know, satellites are still going up, people are still observing the Earth and needing those analytics. And it could be argued needing those analytics maybe even more. I remember one of the things that came out was that they think COVID could have been happening as early as August. And that was because of the photographs being taken of car parks in Wuhan at hospitals. And they were seen to be getting a lot busier since then. So, yeah, I think our industry is still going quite strong in that sense and is definitely still seeing investment. The companies that graduated from SpaceCamp last time are moving very quickly towards closing investments, and I hope the same for our Mission 6 companies that are on your program at the moment.
Okay. And I'm conscious that we're running out of time here, but I have one last question that I'd like to pose to the panel, but also to the audience at large, which is that we've talked about sustainability programs, we've talked about corporate responsibility, we've had Steve presenting the NGO humanitarian industry aspect of it. My sense is that there is not yet a really strong connection between the funding community and the NGO community. It's not something that I see as being very well connected yet between the commercial world and the humanitarian world. I would be really interested to hear about any initiatives that are happening where commercial organizations are using their power and their ability to move things to assist humanitarian actors to do the work that no one else is going to do, which has an impact for all of us. So please do. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I was going to bring something up similar to that. So previously, before joining ACAPs, I worked in the corporate sector for quite a few years, utilities, hence why linked to the Cyient. But what we found is that with NGOs, as we see governments kind of become potentially more populist, and also because of the impact of COVID, the funding that comes in from governments will start to shrink potentially. And so there's potentially a look out to different models of being able to fund. Also looking at your Bill Gates Foundation, for instance, or your different setups there. So there's an interesting discussion there. In terms of support itself, you can also look at humanitarian OpenStreetMap team do some really good kind of mapathon events, which I recommend you look into, which is kind of bringing kind of support to life as well. But there's definitely a discussion about the future of kind of the funding in the sector as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that, that's something that we can all do as individuals. I think it would be really interesting to see more corporate sponsorship of those type of events. Especially for an organization like Cyient, where we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are all digitizing and creating geospatial product every day. If we devoted just a couple of hours on a day like GIS Day towards supporting something like the humanitarian OpenStreetMap, I'm probably going to get pulled off stage here in a second for saying this, but I think that could be something that could really use the power of something that we have to help everyone. With that, I am conscious that we are completely out of time now, so I would like to thank all of our speakers today for joining us and being so willing to be flexible at short notice and talk about what they're doing. I think it's been fantastic, and I'd like to thank you all for being part of GIS Day. And I'd like to wish everyone in the audience a thank you as well for joining us, and a happy GIS Day to everyone else. And with that, I think we'll close the session. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Happy GIS Day.